Hello everyone and welcome back to the Night Teller now. I know you are here to ease into sleep, so before we start, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also drop a comment letting me know where you are tuning in from and what time it is where you are now. Settle in and get comfortable because we're about to start. Story 1. I was invited to spend a weekend at a friend's newly renovated house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a modern place that promised nothing more than good food, laughter, and the comfort of familiar surroundings. I'd known my friend Marcus for years and trusted his taste in both style and hospitality. His house, with its clean lines and warm lighting, was everything a modern home should be: inviting and full of life. Yet, from the moment I arrived, an undercurrent of unease began to stir. Something I couldn't immediately put my finger on it started on the first evening as we gathered in the living room for dinner. The space was expansive, with a wall of glass windows offering a view of manicured lawns and a quiet street. Our conversation ebbed and flowed, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the clink of cutlery. Yet in the background, I noticed a subtle detail: a portrait on the wall behind Marcus's parents' framed photo. It was a painting of a young woman, painted in a realistic style that gave her an almost lifelike quality. At first glance, nothing seemed to miss. The painting was simply a piece of art, perhaps chosen by Marcus's mother for its calming hues. But as I studied it, I felt that the woman's eyes followed me with a quiet intensity that unsettled me. I mentioned it lightly, laughing off my own nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to that painting than met the eye. That night, after dinner, I found myself alone on the back patio. The air was cool and fragrant with jasmine, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of a few nearby trees. I sat in an armchair and sipped coffee, trying to dismiss the nagging feeling of being observed. It was then that I heard a faint sound, a soft scraping, like the rustle of fabric against wood. I listened intently, but the noise was so faint it could have been the wind still. I couldn't help but glance toward the corner of the patio, where shadows gathered. Nothing was visible, only the dark outline of a shrub, but in that moment my skin prickled as though someone had brushed past me. I attributed it to my imagination, fueled by the eerie intensity of the painting, and I tried to relax. The next day brought a bright, clear morning. Marcus had planned a barbecue in the large backyard, and soon the space filled with the hum of conversations, sizzling food, and casual games on the lawn. Despite the cheerful atmosphere, I kept thinking back to the feeling of being watched, to the soft scraping I'd heard on the patio. I tried to focus on the pleasant activities, but every now and that in the midst of the laughter and chatter, a shadow would catch my eye at the edge of my vision, a figure moving just beyond the illuminated area. I mentioned it to Marcus, who assured me that it was probably just a neighbor or a stray cat. I wanted to believe him, but a nagging sense of doubt lingered. That afternoon, while exploring the house on my own, I ventured into a small study on the second floor. The room was decorated modestly, with a neat desk and a few shelves lined with books and knickknacks. On the wall above the desk hung another portrait, this one of a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. As I examined it, I noticed that the paint on the edges of the frame was slightly disturbed, as if someone had recently touched it. I brushed my fingers along the edge and felt a subtle warmth, not from the sunlight, but from something inexplicable. The sensation was fleeting, and I chalked it up to a trick of my senses. In the quiet of the room, I left the study with more questions than answers. That evening, after the barbecue wound down and guests began to leave, I stayed behind with Marcus to help tidy up. The house was nearly empty now, the cheerful buzz replaced by a stillness that felt heavier than before. I walked through the hallways, checking that every light was off and every door was locked. In the dim glow of the hallway light, I noticed something odd near a mirror in one of the bedrooms, a brief flash of movement in the reflection that didn't match my own. I spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. The mirror's surface was spotless, reflecting only the pale light and my own anxious face. I couldn't explain the discrepancy, and I jotted a quick note on my phone before returning to the living room. Over the next 2 days, a series of inexplicable events began to converge. One night, as I was in the kitchen finishing up some dishes, I heard a low, almost inaudible humming coming from the direction of the basement door. It was not a sound I recognized from any appliance. It was a soft, mournful melody that seemed to emanate from deep within the house. I followed the sound cautiously and found that the basement door was slightly ajar. Although I knew Marcus had locked it the previous evening, I pushed it open and descended the narrow stairs, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The basement was cool and musty, filled with old furniture and boxes of forgotten belongings. The humming grew slightly louder, its source indeterminate, as if it were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I reached a corner where a stack of boxes was arranged haphazardly and discovered that one box had been disturbed, as if someone had rifled through its contents. My heart pounded as I carefully opened the box and found among various household items a small old music box. Its exterior was intricately carved, and when I opened it, the soft, melancholic tune began to play, matching the humming I'd heard. I sat there in the flickering light, transfixed, feeling as though the melody carried a deep sorrow. I recorded the moment on my phone. The music box's tune, a quiet echo of something long past. I started to wonder if these strange occurrences were connected to the house's history. Marcus had mentioned that the home was built by his grandparents, who had immigrated here decades ago. He had never gone into much detail about the past, only saying that the house had been in the family for generations. I probed gently, asking if there were any family stories that might explain the odd atmosphere. Marcus hesitated before mentioning in a low voice that there were rumors, old unconfirmed tales of a tragedy that had occurred in the early days of the house, involving a woman who had lived there and mysteriously vanished. He claimed that some said her spirit lingered, a quiet presence that only revealed itself in subtle ways. I pressed him for more, but he only looked away, his expression troubled. I wasn't sure whether to dismiss the stories as old family gossip or to consider them in light of everything I'd experienced that night alone in my room. I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the darkness, the soft hum of the music box echoing in my mind, and I began to review all the evidence I had gathered in my thoughts. The inexplicable warmth on the study's frame, the deliberate scratches I'd noticed in the pavilion, the mysterious note from the ticket booth, the spectral movement in the mirror, and the melancholic tune of the music box. A cold, creeping feeling settled over me, as if the house were breathing around me, its history pressing in with every quiet creak of the floorboards. I resolved that I needed to learn more about the missing woman from Marcus's family lore. The following morning, I approached Marcus gently over cups of lukewarm coffee at the kitchen table. I asked him if he knew any details about the story of the vanished woman. After a long pause, his eyes darkened as he began to speak in a low, hesitant tone. He told me that his grandmother had once whispered that in the early 1930s a young woman had lived in the house, a friend of the family who was known for her kindness and vibrant spirit. One fateful night during a storm that raged across the region, she had disappeared without a trace. No one had ever seen her leave, and no clues had ever been found as to her fate. The story was shrouded in silence, as sorrow a tale passed down in hushed tones but rarely discussed openly. Marcus confided that his grandmother believed the house had never been the same since that night, that there were signs, small things that no one could explain, hinting at her lingering presence. I listened intently, my own experiences aligning eerily with the narrative. Over the next evening, I explored the house with renewed determination. I wandered through the familiar corridors, now imbued with a deeper significance. In the living room, I examined the portrait that had unsettled me on. The first night I discovered that upon closer inspection the background of the painting contained faint, almost imperceptible details, a shadowed figure in the window that might have been the missing woman, her eyes soft with sorrow. I could have sworn I saw a glimmer of her face reflected in the glass on more than one occasion, always fleeting, always just out of focus. Each time the feeling was the same, a deep aching sadness, as if the spirit of the woman was silently pleading for acknowledgement that night. I decided to try something daring. I set up my digital recorder and a camera in the main hallway near the staircase in the hope of capturing any evidence of movement or sound. I sat in the dim light waiting, watching the empty corridor as the hours ticked by slowly. Just before midnight, the silence broke with a series of soft thuds, almost like footsteps echoing from the direction of the old study. I scrambled to retrieve my camera and set it on a tripod, angling it toward the source of the sound. In the grainy recording that followed, I could just make out the shape of a figure walking slowly across the corridor, its motion deliberate and filled with a sadness that was almost palpable. The figure paused at the doorway of the study, then turned, its face partially illuminated by the weak light. I couldn't see his features clearly, but the impression it left was one of profound grief. The camera continued recording for several long seconds before the figure vanished into the darkness. I sat there, heart hammering, uncertain whether I had captured a residual memory of the past or an apparition of the woman from Marcus' story. I left the house at dawn that day, my mind churning with questions. The recordings, photographs, and the whispered account from Marcus had created a tapestry of inexplicable events that could not be easily dismissed. I spent the next few days researching local archives and speaking with neighbors. I learned that the disappearance had indeed been a source of quiet mourning in the community, a tragedy that had been officially unrecorded, but remembered by those who had lived through it. Old newspaper clippings preserved in a town library hinted at a stormy night in 1932, when a young woman had vanished during a gathering at the house. The details were sparse and inconsistent, but they confirmed that something had happened that no one was willing to talk about openly. I photocopied what I could and added the information to my notes, each new detail deepening the mystery. The story of the vanished woman took on a life of its own. As I pieced together the scattered clues, I learned that she had been beloved by her friends and family, a gentle soul whose laughter once filled the rooms. The accounts described her as full of promise, her future bright and hopeful, and yet that promise had been snuffed out on a stormy night when the house, it was said, had become the stage for an inexplicable tragedy. The more I uncovered, the more I felt that the phenomena I'd experienced, the ghostly image in the mirror, the deliberate markings, the soft music from the forgotten music box, were the residual echoes of that one fateful event. One late evening, driven by an impulse, I too couldn't quite explain, I returned to the house alone after everyone had retired for the night. I walked slowly through the now familiar hallways, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and memories. I climbed the stairs to the second floor and paused outside the room that had once been used as a parlor for quiet family gatherings. The door was slightly ajar, and a soft, cool light seeped through the crack. I pushed the door open gently. Inside, the room was bathed in the muted glow of a single lamp, its light falling across a dusty coffee table and a worn sofa on the wall. A faded tapestry depicted a serene landscape, but if you looked closely, you could see a small figure in the background, a woman with long flowing hair in a posture that spoke of deep sorrow. I felt a chill as I stepped closer. It was as if the image was trying to speak to me, to convey the agony of a life cut short. I reached out, touching the tapestry, as if to connect with the past, and in that moment I heard a soft whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was not the sound of a voice, but a sigh, a sound that carried with it a profound sadness. My pulse raced and I backed away, my eyes wide in the darkness. I left the room and closed the door firmly behind me, my mind reeling from the encounter the following morning. I packed my things with a heavy heart. I knew that my time at the house had changed me irreversibly. The experience had opened a window into a past filled with grief and unspoken tragedy, and although I had hoped to find answers, I realized that some mysteries might remain forever shrouded in silence. As I stepped out into the crisp morning air, I took one last look at the house, a modern structure that held centuries of memory in its walls, and I felt a deep, aching sadness for the young woman whose life had ended in that dark, stormy night. I left without looking back, my mind filled with the echoes of the events I had witnessed in the weeks that followed. I shared my experience with a small circle of friends who knew me well, and while some were skeptical, others saw in my words a raw truth that could not be denied. I found that the story had taken on a life of its own, resonating with those who had heard spurs of old tragedies and the lingering sorrow of lives lost too soon. There were no grand resolutions, no promise of further investigation, only the memory of a quiet horror that had been etched into the very fabric of an ordinary house. Even now, when I am alone on quiet, chilly evenings in my own home, I sometimes catch a glimpse of that sorrowful face in a window's reflection, or hear a soft, distant hum that seems to echo the quiet lament of a forgotten past. It is a reminder that some tragedies remain hidden beneath the surface of everyday life, waiting for a moment of reckoning when their secrets are finally allowed to be known. The experience taught me that horror is not always an over-the-top spectacle. It can be a slow, insidious presence that seeps into your mind and refuses to let go, a series of subtle signs that a life ended too abruptly can still haunt the present. I carry that memory with me, not as a burden, but as a solemn reminder of the fragility of existence and the enduring power of sorrow in the quiet spaces between the noise of daily life. I sometimes wonder if the house I once visited has found a way to live on its walls, quietly echoing the unspoken reef of the past, and if somewhere that lost soul still whispers her story to those who are willing to listen. Story 2. I was wandering downtown one humid summer evening when I first noticed it. I'd been out photographing the city for a freelance project, urban textures, graffiti, the hidden details of brick and concrete, when a large, vivid mural on the side of a building immediately caught my eye. At first glance, it looked like any other piece of street art, a riot of colors and abstract forms splashed across a weathered wall. But as I drew closer, I realized that the painting seemed to pulse with an almost imperceptible movement, as if the shapes and figures were shifting ever so slowly when no one was looking. I chalked it up to my imagination. The summer heat plays tricks on your eyes. After all, that night, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The mural's bold strokes and vibrant palette contrasted sharply with the gray monotony of the urban sprawl. I found myself returning to that street, even though it was late and nearly deserted each time I arrived. The painting appeared subtly different. Small details that I hadn't seen before were now visible. One night, a figure in the mural seemed to lean toward me, eyes glistening with a hint of despair. On another, the background swirled into shapes reminiscent of ancient symbols. I began to suspect that this was no ordinary piece of art, but something far more enigmatic. For the next several nights, I made it a habit to visit that block after dark. I spent hours studying the mural from different angles, photographing it with various settings on my camera, and even sketching it in my battered notebook. In these solitary vigils, I documented every subtle change, a flicker of color here, an extra line there, a barely visible tear that seemed to streak down what might be a painted face at times. I noticed that when I walked away, I could almost swear I heard a soft rhythmic tapping echoing from the wall, a sound that vanished as soon as I strained to listen more closely. My curiosity became an obsession. I dove into research about the building's history, the neighborhood, and the street art scene in the city. According to local records, the building had once belonged to an industrial firm that had shuttered decades ago, and the mural had been commissioned only a few years earlier by a group of local artists. No one, however, mentioned any peculiar incidents surrounding the painting, yet I found scattered online posts in old forums where a handful of art enthusiasts claimed that the mural changed on its own. Most dismissed it as an urban legend, but the recollections were disturbingly consistent. Eyewitnesses reported a figure that seemed almost alive, a presence that lingered in the shadows of the painted surface. One humid night with the city unusually quiet and the sky deep indigo, I decided to set up a makeshift tripod and leave my camera pointed at the wall. I wanted to capture any subtle movement over time. Hours passed as I sat alone on a cracked concrete curb, watching the digital display in the dark. Just before midnight, the ambient noise of traffic and distant sirens faded into a background hum, and the screen flickered in a series of time-lapse photos. I captured a slow but distinct change in the mural. A painted hand so delicately rendered, it almost looked lifelike, appeared to move toward the lower edge of the wall, as if reaching for something just out of view. I reviewed the sequence on my camera, my pulse quickening with each frame. The hand wasn't static, it slid ever so slightly, leaving a ghostly trail that defied the permanence of paint. That revelation sparked a series of restless nights. I began leaving notes for myself, recording every change with a mixture of dread and excitement. One evening, I even brought a portable recorder and sat silently in the shadows across the street, capturing ambient sounds in the hope of detecting something more, perhaps a voice or a whisper. At one point, while the recorder captured the sound of a soft tapping and a distant, nearly imperceptible sigh, I realized I wasn't alone. I glimpsed movement in the reflection of a dark storefront window, a flash of a face, pale and sorrowful, looking directly at me. I spun around, but the street was empty, save for the hazy glow of neon in the passing cars. The moment left me shaken, as if someone had reached out from the mural to meet my gaze. In the following days, I expanded my investigation. I began talking to people in the area, asking if they'd ever noticed anything strange about the mural. Most shrugged and said it was just part of the urban landscape, a piece of street art meant to inspire conversation. But one elderly man, leaning heavily on a cane near a rundown bus stop, fixed me with a steady, searching look and said, "That painting, it tells a story of sorrow. My sister used to talk about her girl lost at sea whose spirit wandered these streets." His words, delivered in a low and measured tone, sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't tell if he was simply recounting an old legend or referring to something more concrete. His gaze, however, was unwavering, and it felt as if he were trying to warn me, or maybe to encourage me to look deeper. Motivated by his account, I visited a nearby local library, spending long hours poring over archived newspapers and historical records. I discovered that the building had once been part of a waterfront district that had suffered a devastating storm more than a century ago. There were vague references to a tragic shipwreck that claimed many lives, though details were sparse. The idea that the mural might be connected to a long forgotten maritime disaster filled me with both fascination and dread. I began to wonder if the shifting images in the mural were not just artistic flourishes, but deliberate representations of a past tragedy, an echo of grief and loss from a time when the sea had taken too much. That possibility spurred me to return to the mural each night with renewed determination. I altered my usual route, experimenting with different angles, distances, and camera settings. I even set up a long exposure shot to capture the gradual evolution of the painting over several hours. On one particularly sweltering night, as the air pulsed with humidity and the distant sound of crashing waves reached the city's edge, my camera captured something I could not ignore amidst the vibrant chaos of colors. A section of the mural darkened and twisted into what looked like a sorrowful face. The face seemed to weep, faint streaks of black against the bright backdrop, and its eyes, if they could be called, that appeared to glisten with tears that defied the dryness of the urban air. I felt an overwhelming wave of empathy and despair, as if the art itself were a living memorial to those lost in the cold embrace of the sea. I began documenting every detail, meticulously keeping a log of time, weather conditions, and even the ambient sounds that accompanied each change. I took photographs in bursts, comparing minute differences over the course of each night. With every session, the changes grew more pronounced. The sorrowful face in the mural seemed to intensify, as if the weight of the memories it contained was becoming too heavy to bear. One night, while reviewing a sequence of photos on my laptop in the back of a small apartment I rented for the duration of the project, I noticed that the face's expression had changed entirely. It now bore a look of rage, as if the tragedy had given way to a stinging fury. The transformation was subtle at first, the eyes narrowing and the mouth twisting into a grimace, but it was unmistakable. I felt as though the painting were a record of shifting emotions, a chronicle of a long forgotten disaster that had evolved in the minds of those who had created it. The investigation took on a life of its own. I contacted local historians seeking any records or personal accounts related to the shipwreck and the lost souls of the waterfront district. I learned that decades ago, when the storm had ravaged the coast, a vessel carrying many hopeful souls had capsized, leaving behind families and communities engulfed in sorrow. The details were fragmented: names, dates, and vague descriptions that hinted at a deeper, more tragic story. I wasn't entirely convinced that the mural was directly connected to that event, but the parallels were too strong to dismiss the recurring motifs: the sorrowful face, the persistent changes in expression, and the eerie echoes in the ambient noise suggested that the art was a living testament to a tragedy that had never been fully mourned. One night, as a heavy rain fell and the city's lights blurred into watery reflections on the pavement, I ventured out once more to observe the mural. I found a secluded spot near a narrow alley where I could set up my equipment undisturbed. The downpour was relentless, each raindrop pounding the pavement in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. I turned on my camera and began a long exposure sequence. The shutter opened for minutes at a time to capture the slow evolution of the painting under the shifting conditions of rain and light. In the resulting images, I saw the mural transform in ways that defied logical explanation. What had once been a chaotic explosion of colors now resolved into a near photographic representation of a tragic scene, a rough, shadowy outline of a shipwreck flanked by figures that seemed to reach out from the depths, their eyes empty and forlorn. I sat in stunned silence, my heart heavy with a grief I couldn't quite articulate. It was as if the mural itself had become a portal to a past disaster, preserving the collective sorrow of a community that had long since moved on. I spent the following days compiling my data, every photo, every note, every ambient sound, recording into a digital archive. I created detailed timelines, mapping the changes in the mural against the historical records I'd found at the library. The connections were unsettlingly clear. The date 1993 appeared in several of the archival documents, coinciding with the shipwreck that had devastated the waterfront. Though I could not verify every detail, the evidence pointed to a single conclusion: The mural was not a mere accident of paint and urban decay. It was a deliberate living tribute to those lost at sea, a tragic memory that had been etched onto a wall for all time. My nights became a blur of anxious vigil, each session at the mural filling me with both dread and an insatiable need to understand. I began to sense that the changes in the painting were not random. They were responding to something, perhaps the collective sorrow of those who had once lived through the disaster, or the very spirit of the lost souls reaching out for acknowledgement. In the quiet solitude of the alley beneath a sky heavy with unspoken grief, I found myself whispering questions into the darkness, trying to coax an answer from the silent artwork. There were moments when the air seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy, when the colors in the mural shifted with a languid, almost purposeful rhythm, as if telling a story that I was only just beginning to comprehend. On one final night, as the city's neon glow flickered in the distance and the rain led up to a gentle drizzle, I returned to the mural for what felt like the last time. I positioned myself in a familiar spot, my camera ready, and waited. The air was cooler now, and the autumn atmosphere in the narrow alley was heavy with anticipation. As the minutes ticked by, the mural began its slow, inevitable transformation. The sorrowful face that had haunted me over the past week softened and then hardened again, the images shifting with a deliberate, almost mournful grace. In one long exposure shot, I captured an image that stopped me in my tracks. The abstract chaos of color had coalesced into a clear scene, a final farewell. I saw a figure standing on a rocky shore, the silhouette of a ship in the distance, and in the midst of it all, the eyes of the mural's face met mine. With a look that was at once pleading and resolute, the photograph was raw, unedited, a single moment of undeniable truth captured in the interplay of light and shadow. I left that night with a mix of emotions that defied simple description: an aching sorrow, a deep-seated fear, and strangely a sense of closure. The mural had revealed its secret to me, a tragic memory that was not meant to be forgotten, but to serve as a final testament to the lives lost and the grief that had permeated a community. I returned home, my digital archive, a trove of evidence and haunting images, and I shared my story on an online forum dedicated to urban legends and unexplained phenomena. The response was immediate and varied. Some dismissed my account as an overactive imagination under the pressure of solitude, while others claimed to have witnessed similar changes in the mural or experienced inexplicable feelings of sorrow when passing that street. In the ensuing weeks, local news outlets picked up the story, and a wave of curiosity and mourning spread through the community. The Historical Society, spurred by the newfound evidence, began an official inquiry into the old shipwreck and the lost souls of the waterfront community. Members, many of whom had never spoken of the tragedy, came forward with their own recollections, tales of a night of terror, of desperate pleas for those lost, and of a promise that their memory would endure through any means necessary. The mural, once a colorful burst of abstract art, had transformed into a solemn living memorial, a record of grief that transcended time. A public gathering was held on a cool, clear evening at the very site where the mural stood. Dozens of people, young and old, came together under a sky strewn with stars, sharing in a silent acknowledgement of the past. In a gesture that was both simple and powerful, the local community installed a modest marker near the mural, a single engraved stone with words that captured the collective sorrow and determination to honor those lost. The installation was not dramatic or sensational. It was a quiet affirmation that the legacy of that tragic night was now part of their shared history. That evening, as I walked among the gathered crowd, I felt no desire to retreat into anonymity or to vanish into a routine. Instead, I found myself embraced by a sense of connection, a realization that some mysteries, however painful, bind us together. I looked into the eyes of those who had come, some red with tears, others hard with resolve. And in that moment, the horror of what had been hidden gave way to a fragile hope that by acknowledging the past, we might learn to care for our future. I stepped away from the crowd, not to continue on some endless duty, but to return home with the profound understanding that some truths, however dark, must be faced head-on. I left that place not with a promise of more investigation, but with a vow to never let that tragedy fade into obscurity. The mural, the whispered voices in the rain, the silent images captured in long exposure frames, all these fragments had woven a story that was as much about human loss as it was about the unyielding passage of time. Now, whenever I see a splash of color on a city wall or catch a glimpse of art in an unexpected place, I am reminded of Gray's Reach, a memory of sorrow, resilience, and the quiet power of remembrance that binds us all. That story, born from the shifting hues of an urban mural, remains a testament to the idea that even in our bustling modern world, the echoes of the past can surface in the most unexpected ways. And though the mural continues to change, its message stands clear that grief once etched into the fabric of our collective memory cannot be so easily erased. Story 3. I started volunteering at the Metro Art Collective on a whim. I'd always had a soft spot for creative spaces, places where artists gathered to share their work, where ideas buzzed in every corner. The building was modern and lively during the day, with workshops, galleries, and a cozy cafe that filled its halls with chatter and laughter. But I was hired only for the night shifts, a task that was meant to secure the facility after closing hours. I assumed that the building, bathed in city lights and urban energy, would be safe and uneventful after dark. What unfolded over the course of one particularly long week defied all my expectations and shattered my sense of normalcy. It began on my first night. I clocked in at 11:30 p.m. and took my usual route through the building's corridors. The art center was a converted warehouse with high ceilings and expansive windows that offered a view of the bustling city below. The halls were freshly painted and maintained, their modern decor a stark contrast to the gritty neighborhood outside. In the security office, a small room tucked behind a locked door, I reviewed the digital feeds from the cameras, a mosaic of empty studios, darkened offices, and closed galleries. Everything seemed ordinary, yet as I made my rounds with my flashlight and a digital recorder, an inexplicable feeling of being watched gnawed at me. Around 12:15 am, I was in one of the smaller exhibition spaces, a long, narrow room lined with canvases and sculptures from emerging artists. I paused near a particularly vibrant painting that depicted a chaotic swirl of colors. As I leaned in to clean a smudge off its protective glass, I noticed a peculiar detail on the floor beneath the painting. A series of faint, almost imperceptible scratches trailed in a perfect linear sequence. They looked too orderly to be random scuff marks. I bent down and ran my gloved finger along them. They felt shallow and fresh, as if recently made. I recorded the image on my phone and made a quick note: exhibition hall floor markings, possibly coordinates or a message. The idea that someone might have deliberately etched a message on the polished concrete of a busy art center seemed absurd, yet the clarity of the marks made it undeniable. I continued my rounds, trying to shake off the uneasy sensation that had taken hold of me. In the modern cafe area with its sleek tables and trendy lighting, I noticed that one of the digital clocks on the wall was flickering erratically. The time would jump forward by a few minutes before settling again. I tapped on the control panel, expecting a software glitch, but the issue persisted. I scribbled in my notebook, "Cafe clock anomaly, time jump detected." The explanation could have been a technical fault, but the precision of the jumps, always exactly 3 minutes, seemed too deliberate for a random error. By wonder meme. The building felt different. The hum of daytime creativity was replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. I walked through the corridors with my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. As I passed a glass-walled conference room, I caught a glimpse in the reflection that made my heart skip. A shadowy figure, partially obscured, standing in the center of the room. I spun around, but the room was empty. I checked the security feed on my recorder later. The footage was grainy, but I could make out the faint outline of a person whose eyes seemed to hold an indescribable sorrow. I didn't mention it in my log immediately, but that image haunted me for the rest of the night. In the following days, I tried to maintain a professional routine despite the nagging dread that clung to every shadow. I was responsible for locking up the building, ensuring that all systems were secured, and occasionally cleaning common areas after a late event. The Art Center hosted late-night performance pieces and occasional secret screenings, so there were times when the halls were not entirely empty. But on the nights I was alone, I began to notice more subtle signs that something was off. One evening, while patrolling the back corridors that led to the storage and administrative offices, I found a small scrap of paper taped under a desk. The paper was fragile and written in neat cursive handwriting that I didn't recognize. It simply read, "Her legacy is written in these walls." There was no further context, no name, no date, nothing that linked it to a specific event. I tucked it into my jacket pocket, a chill creeping up my spine. How could a modern art center, with its fresh renovations and bright displays, be connected to such a cryptic message? Curiosity and a growing sense of dread drove me to investigate further. During my breaks, I began browsing through the digital archives stored on the Sense local server, a collection of old exhibition catalogs, event flyers, and newspaper clippings from the past 2 decades. I discovered that the building had once been a community hub that hosted controversial art shows, experimental performances, and even political rallies. One particular article caught my eye. It mentioned an incident during a late-night performance in the early 2000s when a young artist lauded for her visionary work had disappeared in the middle of a show. The report was attributing her vanishing to a sudden lapse in reality and noting that the incident was quickly swept under the rug by administrators. The article contained a faded photograph of a smiling woman in her 20s, whose eyes betrayed a hidden sadness. I felt a connection to that image, though I couldn't yet place how it fit into the puzzle of unexplained occurrences. That same week, my nightly patrols grew more intense. I began to notice that the anomalies were not isolated. In the darkened hallway leading to the performance studio, I recorded a series of events. The precise scratches on the floor, the erratic clock in the cafe, the fleeting shadow in the conference room, and now the soft rhythmic tapping that I began to hear in the walls. At first, the tapping was sporadic. A few measured knocks that I assumed were due to the building's age, but soon it became a steady pattern, like someone was deliberately marking time. I captured the sound on my recorder and listened repeatedly. The pattern was too consistent to be random, a sequence of 4 knocks, followed by a brief pause, repeating slowly. I noted the timing down carefully in my log. The more I collected, the more I suspected that the building itself was a repository for a forgotten tragedy. I approached one night with a new plan. Instead of merely patrolling, I would systematically document every unusual detail. I carried my camera, recorder, and a new digital notebook, and I started mapping the layout of the anomalies. I photographed the scratches along the exhibition hall floor, measured the distances between them, and compared the patterns to the building's architectural blueprint. I scanned every crevice, every reflection, and the strange flickering of lights in the lounge. Every piece of evidence, no matter how small, seemed to suggest that someone had deliberately imprinted a message into the very fabric of the center. I sought out colleagues who had worked at the center during its earlier years. One retired employee, a former curator who had been with the institution during its more turbulent period, agreed to meet with me at a local cafe over bitter coffee in a cramped booth. He recounted his memories of the sense past. He described a time when the space was alive with experimental art and charged debates, when controversies sometimes erupted and voices were raised in protest. Then he hesitated, lowering his gaze. There was one incident, he said quietly, when a young artist disappeared during a performance. No one knows exactly what happened, but some say she was a visionary, a soul who saw too much and couldn't bear the weight of it. They tried to cover it up, but those who cared left small signs, hoping someone would someday piece together the truth. His words struck a chord in me. I pressed him for details, but he only shook his head. Some things are better left buried, but I've never stopped wondering, armed with his vague recollections and the physical evidence I'd gathered. I returned to the center one night with a mix of dread and determination. I set up my equipment in the performance studio, a once lively space that now sat, silent except for the echo of my footsteps. The room was dark, its only light coming from the occasional flicker of a malfunctioning projector. I began a slow, methodical sweep, photographing every wall and floor tile, every smudge of paint that seemed out of place. I was searching for any additional markings, any clues that might tie the present anomalies to that long, forgotten incident. Near one end of the studio, I noticed a series of small, carefully carved symbols in the corner, a pattern that resembled a set of initials or a date. They were etched into the plaster as if by someone with steady hands and a desperate message to deliver. I knelt, heart pounding, and captured the image. My mind raced. Could these symbols be the missing link between the old article I'd found, the whispered rumors, and the physical anomalies I'd recorded? I took several deep breaths, trying to steady my trembling hands, and documented the pattern meticulously. I wrote in my digital notebook. Performance studio corner, etched symbols, possibly initials or a date, must cross-reference with archival materials. That night, as I prepared to leave, the building felt different, charged with a heavy presence that I couldn't ignore. I walked to the main lobby for one final look. The modern artwork on the walls, the vibrant colors that had once been a celebration of creativity, now seemed muted in the dim light. I lingered by a large mirror behind the reception desk. For a moment, I swore I saw the reflection of a young woman standing just behind me, her eyes filled with sorrow. I whipped around, but the lobby was empty. The only sound, the soft hum of the air conditioning. I tried to shake off the chill that had crept up my spine, but the image stayed with me, a silent ghost of a past too painful to dismiss. In the early hours of the morning, I gathered my files, turned off my equipment, and locked up the center. I stepped out into the cool pre-dawn air, my mind a whirlwind of images and questions. The urban landscape outside was awakening, but inside me a darkness stirred. A deep aching certainty that I had witnessed something that defied explanation. I drove home through quiet streets, bathed in the soft light of dawn, the events of the light replaying in my mind like fragments of a broken film. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the experience. I pored over my digital files, comparing photos and audio recordings with the archival reports I'd retrieved from the local library. The evidence taken together pointed to a hidden tragedy. A young artist full of promise and conviction had vanished one stormy night during a controversial performance, and her absence had been shrouded in secrecy. The deliberate marks, the cryptic notes, and even the rhythmic sounds I'd captured were all remnants of an attempt to preserve her legacy, a legacy that the official records had tried to erase. My search for truth led me to reconnect with those who had once been part of that world. I attended a small gathering at a local community center where former employees and longtime residents shared their memories of the art sense heyday. In hushed tones, they recalled passionate debates, spontaneous displays of creativity, and one fateful night when a performance had taken a devastating turn. One elderly woman recounted how the young artist had been a beacon of hope, a brilliant soul whose daring vision inspired everyone around her. But when tragedy struck, the collective grief and fear had driven those who cared to leave behind subtle signs, small tokens of remembrance hidden in the very structure of the building, as if to say that even if she were gone, her influence would persist. These conversations, raw and unpolished with emotion, added layers to the evidence I had gathered. I began to see the Art Center not just as a modern building, but as a living memorial, its walls absorbing the echoes of a past that refused to be forgotten. The deliberate scratches in the lobby were no longer mere oddities. They were the voice of a grieving community, a message from the darkness of a long-silenced tragedy. The etched symbols in the performance studio hinted at a name, a date, or perhaps a secret that had been passed down quietly among those who had witnessed the loss, and the fleeting figure I'd seen in the mirror. That spectral image of sorrow was a haunting reminder that sometimes the past reaches out in ways that defy logic. One evening, driven by a mix of resolve and desperation, I returned to the Art Center for one final investigation. I brought all the equipment I could muster, a high-resolution camera, extra batteries, my digital recorder, and a portable scanner for archival documents. I spent hours retracing every step of my previous patrols, revisiting the corridors and hidden nooks where the anomalies had been most pronounced. I meticulously documented every detail, my hands steady despite the growing dread in my chest. At one point, as I stood in the now silent performance studio, I positioned the camera to capture the etched symbols in their entirety. In the dim light, the pattern of marks glowed faintly on the wall, as if illuminated by an inner fire. I focused the lens and recorded a long, unbroken shot that captured every nuance of the carving. I left the room with a heavy heart, knowing that I had at last compiled enough evidence to piece together the final chapters of that hidden story. I took my findings to a small independent online publication dedicated to urban mysteries and forgotten histories. In a carefully written account that was both clinical and raw, I detailed my experience, my night shifts, the inexplicable physical evidence, the whispered testimonies of a community haunted by loss, and the tragic story of a young artist whose disappearance had been suppressed. The article spread quickly, igniting discussions among former staff, local residents, and curious outsiders. Some dismissed the story as an overactive imagination fueled by isolation. Others, however, shared similar experiences and personal memories that lent weight to my account. The collective narrative that emerged painted a picture of a night filled with unspoken grief and deliberate acts of remembrance, a tragedy that had altered the heart of the Art Center and the community it served. In the weeks that followed, the Art Center's administration, long reluctant to acknowledge the darker chapters of its history, was forced to confront the mounting evidence. A small committee was formed to investigate the old records and the physical clues left behind in the building. In a rare public meeting held in a modest gallery within the center, community members and former employees gathered to discuss the revelations. There was no dramatic confrontation or sensational headlines, only a solemn, measured effort to honor a life that had been extinguished too soon. They debated quietly over archival documents and photographs, their voices low but resolute, determined to ensure that the legacy of that tragic night would not vanish into obscurity. That meeting changed everything. The Art Center, once celebrated only for its bright exhibitions and contemporary vibrancy, was now seen as a repository of hidden truths, a place where beauty and horror intertwined in the scars of its past. The committee decided to create a permanent installation within the center, a small respectful tribute that would feature photographs, diary entries, and physical relics collected over the years. The exhibit, unveiled during a quiet, rainy afternoon, did not rely on supernatural embellishments or overblown theatrics. Instead, it presented the evidence as it was, a series of deliberate marks, careful inscriptions, and personal artifacts that bore silent testimony to a night of unspeakable loss. I attended the opening of the exhibit, standing amid a modest crowd of locals and art enthusiasts who had come to pay their respects. There was no dramatic finale or endless proclamations of, "I will continue the work." Instead, there was a shared moment of quiet acknowledgement, a collective recognition that the tragedy was real and that its impact had forever altered the fabric of the community. As I listened to the soft murmur of conversations and observed tear-streaked faces, I realized that the truth I had uncovered had transcended my own experience. It had become a part of a larger communal healing process, a way for people to confront the darker aspects of their shared past and to honor the unspoken sacrifices that had shaped their present. I left the art center that day with a profound, bittersweet understanding. The experience had not offered easy answers or a neat resolution. Instead, it had revealed a complex tapestry of human emotion, a legacy of grief, resilience, and quiet defiance that refused to be erased by time. The memories I had gathered, the deliberate marks on a polished floor, the cryptic notes hidden in dusty filing cabinets, the fleeting images caught on a shuttered camera, remained etched in my mind like an indelible scar. I drive home on a rainy evening, the city lights blurred by the downpour, and as I passed by the towering skyscrapers, I feel that somewhere amidst the cacophony of modern life, a piece of that hidden truth endures. The Art Center now stands not just as a place of creative expression, but as a somber monument to the past, a reminder that every building, every public space carries within it echoes of the lives that once animated it. The pain of that lost night, the careful relics of memory, and the quiet determination of a community to face its own history have forever changed me. I can still recall in vivid detail the chill of that night, the precise scratches etched into the floor, the soft rhythmic tapping in an empty corridor, and that unmistakable face in the reflection of a broken window. If those fragments, as disparate as they seemed at first, converged into a single haunting narrative, a narrative that refused to be neatly categorized as mere folklore or an overactive imagination. It was a real, tangible tragedy, one that demanded acknowledgement and healing. Now, whenever I catch a glimpse of a familiar urban landmark or pass by an old building with a storied past, I am reminded of that week. I remember the silent corridors of the art center, the measured pace of my patrols, and the lingering sense that the past is never truly gone. It lives on in the small details. The worn edges of a photograph, a hastily scrawled note in a forgotten logbook, the echo of a voice that once filled an empty room. In that realization lies a quiet warning. Even in the heart of a thriving city, shadows of the past can emerge when we least expect them. The experience left me with more questions than answers. And while I eventually resumed my life in the bustling urban landscape, the memories of that hidden tragedy continue to surface in my dreams and quiet moments. They serve as a reminder that even in the places we consider safe and ordinary, the fabric of reality may be woven with threads of sorrow and loss. Threads that, when pulled, unravel a tapestry of forgotten histories and unspoken truths. That night at the Metro Art Collective changed everything. I didn't find a neatly wrapped solution or a promise of further investigation. Instead, I uncovered a legacy of quiet defiance, a story of a lost voice whose echoes still reverberate in the most unexpected corners of our everyday world, and while I have long since stepped away from that role, the lessons of that week remain with me, that every place, no matter how modern or vibrant, harbors secrets of the past, and that confronting those secrets is the only way to truly understand the cost of progress. The memory of that experience lingers like a soft, persistent refrain, a reminder that even amidst the noise of our daily lives, there are moments of stillness where the truth, however painful, demands to be heard. And in those moments we are forced to face not only the ghosts of what was lost, but also the fragile, enduring beauty of what once was. Story 4. I was staying at a hotel I'd never intended to choose, a modern establishment built into the side of a bustling city, promising sleek luxury and modern convenience. I had arrived in the early evening on a business trip that had stretched longer than I'd anticipated. My room, a compact suite on a high floor with expansive views of the city skyline, was advertised as a sanctuary from the urban chaos. I thought the hotel's polished interior and quiet corridors would provide a welcome escape. Instead, my first night there slowly unspooled into a series of inexplicable events that left me questioning my own senses. After a long day of meetings, I returned to my room and began my routine, a hot shower, a light dinner from the in-room service menu, and then settling in front of the television. The room was immaculate, sterile white walls, a soft hum from the air conditioner, and a view that stretched out into a labyrinth of city lights below. I remember the exact moment I first sensed something was off. As I sipped my tea and scrolled through emails on my laptop, I glanced at the window and caught a reflection that didn't belong to the room. For a fleeting second, behind the sleek furnishings and minimalist decor, I saw a dark shape pass in the background, a blurred figure standing motionless, its outline indistinguishable, but its presence undeniable. I blinked hard, dismissing it as a trick of the light or a stray shadow from the passing night, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The next morning, I set out to explore the neighborhood during my day off. I wanted to see if the area might shed any light on the odd occurrences, or if perhaps the building itself held secrets in its modern design. The street was lined with trendy cafes and boutique stores, but there was an undercurrent of something older, a subtle sense that the area had layers. I asked a barista at a small coffee shop about the building. I just stayed in, but she only offered a brief shrug and a forced smile, as if the question was unworthy of a real answer. That night, returning to the hotel after a quiet dinner, I decided to take a different route back to my room. Instead of using the elevator, I opted for the stairs, a decision that seemed trivial at first, but would prove pivotal. The stairwell was narrow and dimly lit by flickering bulbs that cast long wavering shadows on the concrete walls. As I descended, I noticed that the pattern of the shadows seemed to ripple in a strange, almost rhythmic cadence. I chalked it up to the old wiring and uneven surfaces, yet, as I neared the bottom, I heard a soft sound, a subtle, measured tapping that didn't belong to the echo of my own steps. I stopped, heart racing, and listened intently. The sound was steady, like someone gently drumming their fingers against a hard surface, then pausing, then repeating. I couldn't determine its source, but I jotted a note in my phone: stairwell tapping, 11:37 p.m. Unidentified, I resumed my descent, glancing back over my shoulder at the darkened corridor. Nothing seemed out of place, but the chill in my spine remained. The following evening, I returned to the hotel with a mix of determination and dread. I wanted to experience more of the building, to see if the strange occurrences were confined to the stairwell or if they permeated the entire structure. I decided to venture into the corridor. Outside my room, an expanse of polished carpet and stark white walls flanked by identical closed doors. I walked slowly, my footsteps muffled, trying to ignore the nagging sensation that I was not alone. Then I saw it in one of the doorways, a small smudge on the surface that resembled a handprint. It was faint, almost imperceptible, and I rubbed my eyes, but there it was, a human hand pressed against the varnished wood of a door, its outline distorted by time and dim lighting. I approached, hesitating, and took a photo. I made a quick note. Hallway door, faint handprint visible, unclear origin. I continued onward, but that image clung to my mind like a dark watermark. That night, as the clock in the lobby ticked steadily, I lay in bed, replaying the events in my mind. I found myself wondering if the hotel was designed to evoke a certain atmosphere, a modern facade covering an undercurrent of history or even sorrow. I had always been a rational person, skeptical of ghost stories and urban legends, but the things I'd witnessed felt real, undeniable. I forced myself to rationalize. Maybe it was a trick of my tired eyes, perhaps a misinterpretation of ordinary wear on surfaces, but deep down, I sensed that there was something more. Over the next several nights, I began to notice subtle changes in the environment. The soft tapping in the stairwell recurred with unnerving regularity, always coming from the same spot, as if someone were deliberately using it as a metronome in the dark. In the corridors, I caught fleeting glimpses of movement in peripheral vision. Nothing distinct, but enough to make me stop mid-step and peer into the shadows. I even overheard a murmur in the background of the elevator's whirring, a low, almost inaudible whisper that I couldn't quite make out. I recorded these experiences in a private journal detailing times, locations, and the sensations they evoked. My notes grew increasingly frantic, each entry a desperate attempt to capture a moment that defied explanation. One particularly tense night, I found myself unable to sleep. I sat in the small seating area of the lobby. The only sound, the soft hum of the building's climate system and the distant city noise filtering through closed windows. I reviewed the photographs on my phone, scrutinizing every detail. That's when I noticed something new. In one image, taken from the hallway, the reflection in a polished surface revealed a figure, a slender person with features obscured by shadows standing behind me. I froze, heart hammering. I checked the timestamp, 12:03 a.m. Sure. I immediately rewatched the video I had taken that night with the security camera in the corridor. In a grainy loop, a vague outline appeared for only a couple of seconds before vanishing. The footage was inconclusive, but it was enough to shatter my fragile calm. I began to wonder if the building held secrets of its own, stories that were etched into its design and lived on in subtle, unexplainable phenomena. I recalled the faint murmur I had overheard in the elevator and the consistent pattern of handprints and marks in the hallways. I resolved to retrace my steps one final time, determined to map out every anomaly. Armed with a notebook, a digital camera, and a portable recorder, I made my way through the labyrinth of corridors. I documented the textures of the walls, the unevenness of the carpet, and the peculiar positioning of objects that seemed slightly out of place. In one instance, I found a small, intricately carved ornament on a windowsill, a decorative piece that didn't match the modern, minimalist decor of the room. It looked old, its surface worn by decades of handling, yet it was incongruent with the rest of the hotel's design. I took it with me, feeling that it might be a remnant of a previous era, a token left behind by someone who once lived in these spaces. The further I delved into the building's mysteries, the more I began to suspect that there was a story of tragedy hidden beneath its sleek exterior. I approached a middle-floor corridor that led to a series of former conference rooms. Here the atmosphere was strangely oppressive, as if the very air was heavy with unspoken memories. On one wall, I discovered a faint inscription in a delicate cursive hand. The letters were worn but legible, spelling out a single word that struck me with an inexplicable weight. Lost. I took a photo and noted the detail, my pulse quickening as I realized that this was not a random scroll, but a deliberate message, one that resonated with the fragments I had collected. As the days turned into a week, I grew increasingly isolated in the hotel, driven by a need to uncover the full truth of what I had witnessed. I scoured every accessible area, from the upper floors with their panoramic views of the city to the lower service corridors, where the echoes of footsteps and distant sounds seemed to tell a different story. I began to piece together a narrative from the evidence. Subtle markings on polished surfaces, inexplicable handprints in quiet hallways, a carved word on a forgotten wall, and fleeting reflections of figures in windows. The details pointed to a history of quiet sorrow, a story of a life cut short, a presence that lingered in the silent spaces of the building. One night, compelled by a mixture of dread and determination, I decided to set up my equipment in one of the larger conference rooms. The room was vast, with a long table that once hosted important meetings and a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that now offered a breathtaking, albeit lonely, view of the city below. I arranged my digital recorder and camera to capture any unusual activity, setting them to record continuously as I sat in a chair by the window. Outside, the city lights blinked like distant stars, and the gentle hum of traffic provided a background chorus. As midnight approached, I felt the room's temperature drop. Suddenly, the air grew thick, almost tangible, with a weight I couldn't explain. I noticed my breath fogging in front of me, and my hands trembled as I adjusted the camera settings. Then I heard it, a distinct sound, not like the wind or the usual creaks of an old building, but a low, steady murmur that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It was as if the building itself was speaking in a language of sorrow. I strained to listen, and in that hushed moment the murmur resolved into a series of barely audible words, a phrase that sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't make out every syllable, but it sounded like "never forget." The words were swallowed by the ambient noise, almost as quickly as they came, leaving behind a silence that was almost oppressive. I reviewed the recording later that night, my heart pounding as I tried to isolate the sound. It was there, a faint ghostly echo that repeated itself in the background. I noted the phenomenon carefully, adding it to my growing log of unexplained events. Each piece of evidence was a shard of a puzzle that I was desperately trying to piece together, a mosaic of memories and echoes that hinted at a hidden tragedy. In the ensuing days, the incidents grew more frequent and harder to dismiss. The shadowy figures and reflections, the gentle but persistent murmurs in the corridors, and the cryptic inscriptions in overlooked spaces began to form a pattern. I discovered that certain anomalies were concentrated in a particular wing of the hotel, a section that, according to the building's records, had once been reserved for a special group of guests. I recalled overhearing vague references to a tragic event during a casual conversation with the front desk clerk when I first checked in, but nothing concrete had been mentioned. Now, with all the pieces in front of me, it seemed that that wing held the key to the building's hidden history. I decided to explore that wing in detail. The corridor was dimly lit, and the air was cooler here, as if it had been sealed away from the rest of the building for decades. I walked slowly, every step measured, my eyes scanning for anything out of place. Near the end of the corridor, I found a door that was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I entered a suite that appeared to have been a private guest room. The room was impeccably maintained compared to the rest of the hotel. Its furnishings were elegant, its decor timeless. On the bedside table lay an old leather-bound diary, The cover was embossed with intricate patterns, and its pages were filled with careful flowing script. I sat on the edge of the bed and began to read, drawn in by the delicate handwriting that chronicled moments of joy, sorrow, and deep personal reflection. The diary belonged to a guest who had apparently stayed in the room many years ago. As I turned the pages, I reached an entry dated on a day that matched one of the inscriptions I had seen elsewhere. The entry was haunting in its brevity. Tonight, in the midst of celebration, I lost her. I begged that this sorrow not be erased. The words struck me with a force I hadn't anticipated. A raw, unfiltered grief that seeped into every line. The diary ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted by an unimaginable event. I left the room with the diary clutched tightly in my hand, my mind awash with questions. Who was her? What tragedy had taken place in this hotel? And why was it so carefully hidden? I made my way back through the corridor, feeling as though I were carrying a heavy secret with me. The hotel, with all its modern trappings and pristine surfaces, suddenly seemed less like a sanctuary and more like a repository of hidden sorrows, a place where the veneer of luxury barely concealed the scars of the past. That night I decided to return to the suite and read the diary again, hoping to glean any more clues from the carefully penned words. I sat on a plush armchair in the dim light, the sound of distant city traffic, a muted background hum. As I reread the entry, I was struck by a vivid detail. The mention of a specific place on the hotel grounds where she had been lost. The diary described a small garden at the rear of the hotel, a secluded area that had once been a tranquil oasis for guests. According to the entry, the garden had been the scene of a private celebration, one that had turned tragic in an instant. The writer's tone was desperate, pleading for the memory of her to be preserved, even as the festivities descended into chaos. The next morning, fueled by a mixture of dread and curiosity, I sought out the hotel's public records in the small archive, kept in the basement of the front office. I spent hours combing through old newspapers and guest registries, searching for any mention of an incident that might correspond with the diary account. In a fragile yellowed clipping, I finally found a reference, a brief, unremarked note about a private party held in the hotel's garden several years ago. The note mentioned that a guest had vanished under mysterious circumstances during the celebration, but the report was curt and buried within pages of routine business. It offered no explanation, only the chilling fact that someone had been lost on that night. I photocopied the article and added it to my growing collection of evidence. That night, the hotel's atmosphere felt different, more charged, as if the building itself were on the verge of divulging its long-held secrets. I returned to the corridor of the special guest wing and lingered outside the suite where I'd found the diary. The air was cool and still, and the muted glow of a street lamp outside painted long wavering shadows on the polished floor. I sat on the edge of a small bench and stared at the closed door, my mind replaying the diary's haunting words. Suddenly, as if in response to my silent vigil, I heard a soft sound, a gentle creak of a door opening. I jerked my head up, heart pounding, and saw that the door to the suite was slightly ajar once more. My hands trembled as I approached and pushed it open. Just a crack. The room was empty, exactly as it had been when I first entered, but on the bedside table lay something new, a single white rose, delicate and unfaded, resting on a small note that read simply "Forever at our hearts." I stared at it, unsure whether it was a coincidence or an intentional message. The discovery left me reeling, and I quickly took a photograph before the rose and note disappeared into the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that every anomaly, every carefully hidden artifact was building toward a singular, inescapable truth. Over the next few days, I pored over my collected evidence, photographs, the diary, the archival clipping, and the image of the white rose, and attempted to piece together the narrative of that tragic night. The fragments coalesced into a story of a private celebration turned calamity. A night when a guest, a young woman known for her radiant smile and vibrant energy, had been lost in a moment of horror. The official records had downplayed the event, attributing her disappearance to a personal decision to leave. But the private testimonies and hidden relics told a different tale, a tale of a sudden, inexplicable loss that had shattered the joy of the celebration and left a scar on the hotel's soul. I confronted the hotel manager the following morning. I found him in his modest office on the ground floor, surrounded by neatly organized files and a view of the bustling lobby below. I laid out my evidence, a series of photographs, a copy of the old newspaper clipping, and excerpts from the diary, and asked him to explain the discrepancies between the public record and the private memories preserved in the building. His face turned pale as he listened. After a long, tense silence, he admitted that the incident had indeed occurred. A private party had been held in the hotel's garden, and one of the guests had vanished under circumstances that were never fully explained. The matter had been hushed up to avoid scandal, and over time, the memory of the tragedy had been deliberately obscured. He confided that even he, who had managed the hotel for years, rarely spoke of that night. His eyes were haunted by regret, as he recalled how the loss had left an indelible mark on everyone who had been there. The conversation with the manager shattered any remaining illusions I had about the hotel's pristine reputation. The building, with its modern design and sleek surfaces, was layered with secrets and sorrow, a juxtaposition of contemporary luxury and hidden tragedy. I felt a deep responsibility to honor the truth of what had transpired there. With the manager's reluctant cooperation, I arranged to have the story made public, a full account that combined my personal experiences, the tangible evidence I had gathered, and the private memories of those who had once been a part of that fateful night. In a small press conference held in a local community center, I recounted the series of events in careful detail. I spoke not as a sensationalist, but as someone who had witnessed the slow unraveling of a hidden tragedy, a story of joy turned to grief, of celebrations interrupted by the abrupt disappearance of a bright, vicious soul. The room was quiet, filled with community members who shared similar unspoken memories of that night. For many, the revelation was both painful and cathartic, a validation of their own lingering doubts, and a call to acknowledge a loss that had been buried under official silence. The public report sparked a wave of new interest in the hotel's history. Former guests, employees, and local residents began to share their recollections, each adding their own pieces to the narrative. There were murmurs of quiet gatherings in which the young woman's name was spoken with reverence, and tales of a sudden, inexplicable event that had sent shockwaves through a community too proud to admit its pain. The collective memory of that night, once confined to whispered rumors and faded files, began to take shape as a living, evolving testament to the fragility of life and the hidden costs of ambition. I attended one of the community gatherings, a modest, somber assembly in a renovated section of the hotel that had been preserved as a memorial. There were no elaborate speeches or dramatic ceremonies, only a quiet, heartfelt acknowledgement of a truth that had been kept hidden for too long. In the soft light of the room, I watched as old photographs were displayed, as family members of former staff and guests recounted fragments of that night. The atmosphere was heavy with grief, but also with a sense of release, a communal exhalation after years of silent suffering. A simple plaque was unveiled near the main entrance of the hotel, bearing an inscription that spoke not in grand sweeping statements, but in honest, unadorned words for those who were lost, for the memories that endure. I left the memorial that day with no fanfare. Not as if I were returning to some mundane routine, but with the profound realization that some tragedies are so deeply etched into our collective history that they cannot be undone by time or by silence. The hotel, once a symbol of modern luxury, had been transformed into a sanctuary of remembrance. A place where the past was not hidden beneath glossy surfaces, but acknowledged in its raw, painful truth. I drove away through a city that suddenly seemed richer in its complexities, every light and shadow a reminder of lives lived and lost, of secrets that refused to fade. In the weeks that followed, I found that the experience had changed me. The ordinary hustle of the city, the simple beauty of modern design, all carried a hidden weight, a reminder that behind every polished veneer can lie a story of sorrow and resilience. I began to notice these echoes everywhere. In a kindly old shop window, where a faded poster of a bygone era caught my eye. In the quiet whispers of a crowded cafe, even in the soft murmur of a familiar tune on the radio, I had witnessed a truth that went beyond any one job or one building. It was the echo of humanity, a reminder that every moment carries with it the potential for both beauty and unspeakable loss. Now, whenever I pass by that once luxurious hotel, now recontextualized as a memorial, I catch a glimpse of its complex soul, a blend of sleek modernity and the enduring scars of a tragic past. The images of that night, the careful inscriptions, the desperate messages etched in time, remain with me, not as an endless burden, but as a lasting testimony to the human capacity to endure, to remember, and to transform sorrow into a quiet collective strength. Even today, the experience serves as a reminder that sometimes the most chilling horrors are not born from supernatural apparitions or overblown legends, but from the very real, often hidden tragedies of life. A lesson that every polished surface and every bright light may conceal a story of profound loss, waiting patiently for the day when the truth can finally emerge.